Speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. The Adriano Emperor. A suicide to avoid the fall of Rome. Discover the tragic story of one of the most powerful emperors, but also more tormented. Subscribe and activate the bell so as not to miss anything. And there is the mystery, right? Adriano's death, a powerful emperor, a tireless builder, a man who left his mark throughout the empire, wrapped in a veil of uncertainty. Historical sources offer us contradictory versions. Some talk about disease, others of poison, even suicide. But the truth, friend, hides between the lines, between what is said and what is silent. What really happened in those last days of your life? Some historians point to a prolonged disease, perhaps a combination of ailments that undermine their health over time. Imagine the weight of an empire on its shoulders, crucial decisions, wars, intrigues, a physical and mental where that could have weakened it until death. But lack of precise details about his illness leaves space for speculation. Another theory, much more dramatic, speaks of poisoning. A palatial conspiracy. A secret enemy who sought its end. The possibility of a plot is not far-fetched, considering the power struggles that occurred in the Roman court. But, again, the lack of overwhelming evidence maintains the alive mystery. Who would dare to poison an emperor? Trajan's wars, remember, he expanded the empire as few, reaching Dacia, conquering territories that seemed unattainable. Imagine the Roman power in its peak, the wealth that flowed to Rome from all the corners of the empire, an empire that seemed invincible under its reign. That he left everything ready for his successor, or not. His legacy was not limited to military conquests, Trajan was a great builder, a visionary who left his brand in Rome with impressive works. The Trajano Forum, the column that bears his name, colossal structures that even today amaze us. His reign marked a high point in Roman engineering and architecture. But beyond the stones and concrete, Trajan left an efficient administration, a prosperous and stable empire. There was an order, a sense of security and power that extended throughout the empire. It was a golden age for Rome, a time of splendor that Adriano inherited, a heavy inheritance that, perhaps, weighed too much. But the greatness of Rome was not inherited only by imperial blood. Think of Adriano, grandson of a liberation, a man born outside the circle of power, climbed positions with an ambition and an unusual intelligence. His rise was not easy. He had to make his way between palatial intrigues and political rivalries, but his ability to strategy and his political cunning allowed him to stand out. His military intelligence was key. Under Trajan, he demonstrated his value on the battlefield, winning the respect and confidence of the emperor. Imagine military campaigns, dust, sweat, strategy. Adriano learned from the best, absorbing knowledge and polishing their command skills. This learning was crucial for later reign. Trajan's death marked a turning point. The imperial succession was not clear, but Adriano, with his political ability and the support of key figures, knew how to navigate the complexities of Roman power and ensure his rise to the throne. It was not a simple ascension, but his determination and intelligence allowed him to overcome obstacles and become an emperor of Rome. Incredible, right? Of grandson of a liberation to rub shoulders with the emperors. But that ascent was not a path of roses. Adriano had to navigate between the palatial plots, the silent conspiracies, the whispers in the power corridors. Imagine the constant pressure, the need to gain the confidence of those who could make you fall with a simple whisper. Each favor granted, each neutralized enemy. Every step in the staircase of power was a risky bet. He had to demonstrate loyalty, cunning, and, above all, an unparalleled ability to read his rivals. A bad movement, a wrong alliance, and his career would have collapsed under the weight of imperial intrigues. The Roman court was a nest of vipers, friendships forged in the fire of need, broken alliances with the same ease. That he had to move surgical precision, anticipating the movements of his enemies, weaving his own networks of influence with millimeter care. That an error and the sword of betrayal could fall on it without warning. But what happened in that first crucial year? After the death of Antonino Pio, the succession was not simple. You saw how complicated the power game was in Rome. Adriano, newcomer to the throne, had to deal with uncertainty, with the possible conspiracies of those who saw him as a usurper. His first objective was clear: to consolidate his power and ensure his reign. Prosody, speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. Imagine the pressure, right? He had to win the loyalty of the army, fundamental to any Roman emperor. That meant constant trips to the borders of the empire, military inspections, and above all, to show itself as a strong and decisive leader that no error could be allowed. Any weakness would be exploited without mercy. In addition to the military force, Adriano knew that he needed the support of the Senate. Remember, he was not from a traditional imperial family. Therefore, he had to move carefully, gaining the confidence of the most influential senators, showing their intelligence, their government capacity, and, of course, their generosity. The bribe, even if it is not said openly, was part of the game. He came to power, yes, but Adriano was not a warrior like Trajan. He was a man of letters, an intellectual, an art lover, and architecture. Imagine. An emperor who preferred the company of philosophers and poets to that of generals. Of course, do not be wrong, his intelligence was acute, and his political capacity undeniable. Behind that cultured facade, a leader capable of maintaining the united empire was hidden. But he was also a complex man, sometimes cruel, sometimes insecure. His reign was marked by constant ambivalence. A great builder, a law reformer, but also a ruler capable of acting with implacable hardness when he considered it necessary. Remember that the stability of the empire was its obsession, and it would maintain it at any price. His personality, a mixture of sensitivity and pragmatism, of genius and cruelty, is what makes him so fascinating. He was not a legend hero, but a man of flesh and blood, with his virtues and his defects, his lights and his shadows. That an emperor who, despite his contradictions, left an indelible mark on the history of Rome. And you, what do you think of your personality? But do not be wrong, even if he preferred the books to the sword, Adriano was a brilliant military strategist. His reign was not exempt from conflicts, and he had to face several threats at the borders of the empire. Remember that he was not a conqueror like Trajan, but an exceptional administrator who knew how to defend the conquered. In Britannia, for example, he consolidated the defenses and ordered the construction of Adriano's famous wall, an impressive engineering work that marked a milestone in Roman military history. Think of logistics, planning, and the deployment of resources necessary for a work of that magnitude. That speaks of its strategic capacity. He also knew how to manage tensions in the east of the empire, suffocating rebellions and maintaining peace in key regions. It was not only brute force, but a skilled combination of diplomacy, strategic alliances, and, when necessary, the forceful use of the Roman army. His knowledge of the land and the political situation was crucial. But the threats were not still. From Britannia, with his indomitable tribes, to the borders of the Danube, where the barbarians stalked, Adriano had to maintain peace. Think about the weight of an empire on your shoulders, the responsibility of millions of lives depending on your military decisions. It was not just a matter of glory, but of survival. The limes, that imaginary line that marked the limit of the empire, needed to be constantly reinforced. Adriano ordered the construction of a wall in Britannia, a monumental work that even today tells us about his determination. But not just walls it was. They needed strong garrisons and an effective military strategy to contain the enemies of the empire. Imagine the Roman legions, with their shiny armor and their eagles waving in the wind, patrolling the borders, building fortifications, and facing the barbarians in bloody battles. Each victory, each defeat, molded the map of the empire, and defined the legacy of Adriano. He understood that the greatness of the empire depended, to a large extent, on the strength of its borders. But what was that wall that worried Adriano so much? Imagine a stone snake, gigantic, winding through the geography of Britannia. We talked about the Adriano Wall, a militaries of military engineering that extended for almost 120 kilometers, from the Ireland Sea to the North Sea. For you, it was a clear demonstration of Roman power, an impenetrable border that protected the empire of the wild tribes of the north. Its construction was a monumental effort, a challenge to nature itself. Beyond its defensive function, Adriano's wall was a symbol of power. Its construction, a demonstration of organizational capacity and the military force of Rome. Think of the thousands of soldiers, workers and artisans who participated in their creation, in the logistics necessary to transport materials and supply so many people in a hostile territory. For you, it was an unequivocal statement. Rome had come to stay, and his empire was impregnable. Prosody, speak. Speak, prosody rate equals 90%. The wall was full of strengths, surveillance towers and advanced positions, strategically located to control the movement of people and goods. Each stone, every sentinel, every fortification, spoke of Rome's determination of maintaining control over their territories. For you, it was a testimony of the Roman military organization, a complex defense network that extended throughout the border. A system that, although expensive, ensured the stability of the empire. But Adriano's wall did not arise out of nowhere, right? Before, there was the conquest of Britannia, a titanic task for the Romans. Imagine the legions, with their shiny armor under the British sun, advancing for unknown territories. They faced warrior tribes, wild landscapes, and an unpredictable climate. For an emperor like Adriano, controlling this island was fundamental for the security of the empire. The British resistance was fierce. Tribes such as the Bryants or the Silures proved to be a hard root bone. It was not a simple triumphal march. There were bloody battles, prolonged sieges, and betrayals. Think about the logistics effort. Transport men, weapons, provisions. A true feat of military organization and strategy, something that only an empire like Rome could carry out. Conquering Britannia meant not only subjecting tribes but also integrating them, to some extent, to the empire. Cities, roads were built, and Roman government systems were established. But the resistance continued, latent under the surface of the apparent peace. The conquest was a long and complex process, full of challenges and triumphs, which left a deep mark on the history of Rome and Britannia. But the construction of the wall was not his only concern. Adriano, was an active emperor. Imagine the young emperor, even with the energy of his youth years, directing the Roman legions in campaigns throughout the empire, from the borders of the Rhan to the distant lands of Dacia. Its presence was felt. His military strategies, the result of an exhaustive study and a brilliant strategic mind, made him a feared and respected figure in equal parts. Think of the roar of the battles, the clash of the swords, the clamor of the soldiers. Adriano was not limited to observing from afar. He actively participated in the campaigns, showing a personal value that inspired his troops. His ability to evaluate the terrain, anticipate enemy strategies, and make quick and effective decisions made it an exceptional military leader. He was the heart of his legions, the force that promoted them to victory. His military victories not only expanded the territory of the empire, but also consolidated their power and authority. Each triumph closer to the legend, but also confronted it with the harsh reality of war, with the loss of lives and the weight of responsibility. Despite glory, the shadow of death always stalked on the battlefield, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and power. But the conquests and the wall were only part of their legacy. You will see how Adriano, unlike other emperors, focused on administrative efficiency. Imagine it, reviewing reports, optimizing the tax collection system, ensuring that the grain will reach Rome and the provinces. A complex system, but under his command, worked with amazing precision. His communications network was key. You would be surprised by the speed with which the information moved throughout the empire under its government. An efficient postal system, with strategically located stations, allowed the imperial orders to arrive on time and that the problems be resolved with agility. That efficiency was reflected in the stability of the empire. In addition, Adriano implemented a more fair and efficient judicial system. Think about it. The Roman bureaucracy, sometimes slow and corrupt, was renovated to guarantee a more equitable legal process. Corruption was reduced and procedures were expedited, reinforcing confidence in the imperial government. This contributed greatly to peace and stability, but its impact in Rome transcended the administration. Think about justice in order. Adriano understood that a strong empire needs fair and firm laws. He was responsible for reforming the Roman legal system, simplifying procedures and ensuring that the law would apply equally, regardless of your social position. Imagine an emperor worried not only about building, but to ensure that justice will reach every corner of its vast empire. Under his reign, he worked on the coding of the right, creating a clearer and accessible system. This not only benefited Roman citizens, but also the provinces, where the application of the law was sometimes inconsistent. Adriano sought equity and transparency, a key element to maintain peace and stability in such a large and diverse empire. You could see this as a fundamental piece of its legacy, as important as the wall. Prosody, speak. Speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. Laws were reviewed and unified, eliminating ambiguities and contradictions. It was a monumental effort that laid the foundations for the subsequent evolution of Roman law, influencing legal systems for centuries. Remember that, for Adriano, justice was more than an abstract concept. It was a fundamental pillar for the solidity and longevity of his empire. It was an integral part of his vision of Rome. a vision that sought to implement with rigor and determination. But the fortress of Rome under Adriano was not based only on laws. Imagine the immense empire, its commercial routes, the constant flow of goods. We talk about an economy that flourished. The trade was vibrant, with routes that connected from the distant British to the deepest Egypt. You could see ships loaded with grain, silk, spices. A real global exchange, right? However, not everything was gold in the empire. Remember that maintaining such a vast empire had its challenges. The administration was expensive, the legions needed resources, and the infrastructure, such as aqueducts and roads, required huge investments. Managing the economy of such an extensive territory was a constant challenge for Adriano. Think about the pressure of feeding millions of people. Agriculture was fundamental, but the crops could fail, causing famines and revolts. Adriano had to deal with these crises, implementing measures to ensure food supply and control prices. Managing inflation was another constant concern. Can you imagine the weight of that responsibility? But Adriano's greatness was not limited to the economy. Think about art, what a flourishing time. Under his reign, Roman architecture reached impressive levels. You could marvel with the details of the buildings, the precision of the sculptures, the majesty of their constructions. Remember the Pantheon, for example, a masterpiece that still leaves us breathless. And literature, what do I tell you about literature? Renowned authors flourished under the patronage of Adriano. Imagine papyrus rolls, libraries full of knowledge. The exchange of ideas. It was a fertile period for artistic thought and expression. Many writers found inspiration for their works, leaving an invaluable legacy for future generations. The sculptures of the time reflect the sophistication and realism of the time. Observe anatomical precision, the expression of faces, the fluidity of the movements. They were works of art that sought technical perfection and aesthetic beauty. Not only represented mythological figures, but also realistic portraits of important characters, including Adriano himself. And speaking of wonders, did you ever see the Pantheon? That masterpiece of Roman engineering, with its imposing concrete dome, is a direct legacy of Adriano. Imagine the project scale, the millimeter precision necessary to build something like this almost 2,000 years ago. It is a structure that leaves you breathless, a symbol of human capacity to create beauty and endurance. But the Pantheon is not the only architectural jewel that Adriano left us. Remember the Adriania Wall in Britannia, a colossal defense work that winds through the landscape. Think of the titanic effort, the impeccable organization, and the military strategy that required its construction. It is an impressive sample of Roman power and the strategic vision of its emperor. In addition, we cannot forget the many public villages and buildings that Adriano ordered to build throughout the empire. From imposing palaces to majestic temples, each structure reflected the refined taste and immense power of his reign. Each stone, each column, each mosaic tells a story of greatness and ambition. And you, what do you imagine seeing these constructions? And speaking of the Pantheon, imagine a temple dedicated to all the gods, to all. It was not only a building, but a reflection of the vast and complex Roman Pantheon. From Jupiter, the king of the gods, to the nymphs of the forests, all had their place in this monumental space. Think about the magnitude, the feeling of unity that should inspire that place. It was a space open to religious diversity, a place where the statues of gods and goddesses of different cultures could be found, incorporated into the Roman belief system. A true melting pot of beliefs, a testimony of the empire's ability to absorb and assimilate the traditions of the conquered peoples. Can you imagine the amount of offerings and rituals that were held there? Beyond the deities, the Pantheon represented the very idea of Roman imperial power, its ability to integrate and control different cultures and religions under the same roof. It was a statement of power, a sample of greatness and ambition of Rome, but also a symbol of tolerance and religious coexistence, at least in appearance. Remember that the Roman Empire was a complex place, full of contradictions. Prosody, speak. Speak, the prosody rate equals 90%, but let's go back to Adriano. His power was not only reflected in the Pantheon, but also in his spectacular Villa Adriana, in Tivoli. Imagine a place that exceeded any imaginable palace. A true earthly paradise created for rest and delight. A gigantic complex, with buildings inspired by Greece, Egypt, even in Rome itself. A space where you could miss between gardens, fountains, and impressive temples. There were libraries full of knowledge, theaters for representations, even a huge thermal complex where you could relax in hot water pools. Everything was designed for Adriano's comfort and pleasure. Think of the bright mosaics, in marble sculptures, in the exuberance of precision-controlled nature at a microcosm of the empire, but on a personal scale, a place where the emperor could escape the weight of his crown. It was a reflection of his complex personality. A cultured man, lover of art and philosophy, but also a firm and sometimes ruthless ruler in Villa Adriana. He found a balance, a shelter where he could be himself, far from the political intrigues and the challenges of the empire, an oasis of peace, an earthly paradise built with the power and richness of the Roman Empire, a last sigh of greatness before the storm. But before continuing with Adriano's life, let's talk about a monument that deeply marked the Roman Empire. Trajan's Column. Think of her, imposing, a testimony of power and glory. For you, what does that column represent? Simply an architectural work or something deeper, a declaration of imperial intentions? Adriano, aware of the greatness of his predecessor, did not ignore her. Trajan's Column was not only a structure, but a symbol of the continuity of the empire. For Adriano, it meant the inheritance that should honor and expand. Can you imagine the pressure of following the steps of such a successful emperor? However, Adriano was not limited to simple admiration. His reign was also characterized by renewal. He understood that continuity did not imply stagnation. He sought his own way of leaving his mark, of showing his own power and vision, not forgetting the legacy of Trajan. How do you think this balance was achieved? But let's go back to Adriano. His reign was not only characterized by war and administration, but also by an impressive construction program. Think of the bathrooms of Caracalla, a wonder of Roman engineering. Imagine the scale, the majesty. A place where people gathered, not only to clean themselves, but to socialize, to enjoy a relaxation day in the middle of the hustle and hustle of the city. A true social center, a meeting space for all strata of society. These bathrooms were not simply a place to wash. They were a gigantic complex with cold, temperate and hot pools, gyms, libraries, and even gardens. We talk about a space designed for leisure and recreation, an oasis of peace in the middle of the bustle of Rome. Imagine yourself there, enjoying a hot bath after a long day, surrounded by the opulence of the Roman Empire and unique luxury. The architecture of the Bagnus de Caracalla is a testimony of the Roman ingenuity. Its design, its scale, the complexity of its heating system. All this represents an impressive achievement for its time. These bathrooms were not only a symbol of imperial power, but also an example of sophistication and technological advancement of Rome, an architectural legacy that still leaves us amazed. But did you know that Adriano felt an almost obsessive passion for Greek culture? His reign marked a true Hellenic rebirth. He himself considered a great admirer of Greek philosophy and art, and that was reflected in his political decisions and in the works he ordered to build. Imagine temples, libraries, gyms, all inspired by the classical Greek aesthetics. It was not just imitation. Adriano was a Greek artist and body patron. He commissioned sculptures, supported poets and philosophers, and promoted the study of Greek language and literature throughout the empire. It was a golden age for Hellenic culture, a flowering thanks to its support and sincere admiration. Think of the Villa Adriana in Tivoli, a true architectural jewel that reflects his love for Greece. There he recreated Greek landscapes and buildings, creating a microcosm of the Hellenic world. It was his refuge, his escape, a place where he could dive completely in the culture he admired so much, a magical place, right? But his love for Greece did not stay in passive admiration. Adriano was an exceptional patron, a true driver of the arts. Imagine, the amount of works that sponsored. From the reconstruction of Greek temples to the sculpture commission and the construction of impressive libraries, he wanted to immortalize his passion, his vision of a Roman Empire enriched by Greek beauty. Prosody, speak. Speak, prosody rate equals 90%. Not only did he focus on architecture. Think of the artists who flourished under their generous sponsorship. He commissioned masterpieces of sculpture, paintings that celebrated classical beauty, and even supported poets and writers who disseminated Hellenic culture throughout the empire. His generosity transformed the artistic panorama of his time. His legacy as patron transcends his reign. Even today, you can admire the constructions and works of art that survive the passage of time, silent witnesses of Adriano's passion for Greek culture and their commitment to the flowering of the arts. He was an emperor who left an indelible mark, not only in political history, but also in the history of art. But Adriano's greatness was not limited to stone and marble. His cut became an intellectual hotbed, a melting pot where the brightest ideas of the empire merge. Imagine you, sitting in one of those imperial gatherings, listening to the most important philosophers of the time discussing the nature of the good, virtue, and destiny of man. A vibrant atmosphere, full of scholarship and controversy. Epictetus, with his unwavering stoicism, surely argued with other thinkers. His teachings on the control of emotions and the acceptance of fate resonated in the palace halls. You could have witnessed those debates, full of passion and bright arguments, where the search for truth was the main objective. Can you imagine the weight of those words, echoing through the centuries? The court of Adriano was not only a space of political power, but also a center of philosophical thought and discussion. It was a place where ideas flourished, challenging each other in an unprecedented intellectual exchange. For you, as a witness of that moment, it would be an unforgettable experience, an encounter with the brightest minds of its time, shaping the future of the empire. But do you know how Adriano was private? Beyond the emperor, there was a complex, passionate man. His relationship with Antonou, a young man of extraordinary beauty, transcended the simple friendship. It was a deep love, which inspired works of art and sculptures that even today are astonished. A love that, however, was not exempt from imperial politics. Think about power, control, image, everything was intertwined. Adriano cultivated strategic friendships, ties that extended beyond the borders of the empire. These relationships, although personal, served their political objectives. A handshake, an intimate dinner, a letter, each gesture counted. It was an invisible power of power, woven with wires of loyalty, trust, and sometimes also with manipulation threads. Can you imagine the complexity of your game? His private life, with his loves and friends, was intrinsically linked to his public life. They were not two separate worlds, but two sides of the same currency. Each personal decision, each effective bond, had political implications. To what extent did ambition and power influence their most intimate relationships? That is a question that I leave you for reflections while we continue to explore the fascinating life of this emperor. But Antonou, who really was? Beyond its beauty, which captivated the emperor, a mystery loom. Its humble origin contrasts with its meteoric ascent to the court. Was it simply a favorite, or something else? Historical sources offer us contradictory fragments, leaving space for speculation. His influence in Adriano was undeniable, but to what extent? His sudden death at 20, during a trip to Egypt, adds another layer of enigma. An accident? A murder? The official version speaks of a tragic drowning, but conspiracy theories abound. Some suggest that it was a ritual sacrifice, an act of devotion to ensure the favor of the gods or to protect the emperor. Can you imagine? After his death, Antonou was divinized, becoming an object of imperial worship. Temples and statues in his honor were erected throughout the empire, a testimony of Adriano's deep veneration. His image, idealized and omnipresent, perpetuates the mystery that surrounds his life and death. Why so much posthumous exaltation? But the shadow of death is already in the Adriano. The old age, relentless, began to show its claws. Remember those long days of government, the innumerable Libertad battles, crucial decisions, all that effort left its brand. A disease, slow but inexorable, was undermining his health. You imagine the emperor, once, now weakened, his body betraying him? His body, which once toured the empire from end to end, became increasingly fragile. The pain became his constant partner, a relentless reminder of his mortality. The long hours of work, which I enjoyed before, now became a torture. Can you imagine the weight of an entire empire on somewhat weaker shoulders? Prosody, speak. Speak, the prosody rate equals 90%. The decisions, which previously made precision and firmness, now became more difficult. The mind, acute, began to fail. The disease not only affected his body, but also his spirit. What would it be like to see the empire, that you loved and built, starting to crumble, knowing that you could no longer stop it? But the tranquility of the empire, so carefully built by Adriano, began to crack. Remember the distant borders, The always restless barbarian tribes' rumors of rebellions came from the furthest provinces, echoes of discontent that extended as a dark spot on the map of the empire. You, as a witness of his reign, could feel the growing tension in the air, a latent threat that even the powerful emperor could not ignore. In Britannia, the legions faced a fierce resistance. The news brought stories of bloody battles and defections that it was not just the barbarians who represented a threat. Internal corruption, the excessive ambition of some generals, and conspiracies in the imperial court itself became an equally real danger. Can you imagine the pressure on Adriano, dealing with these threats simultaneously? The pressure was immense. The conspiracy murmurs intensified, feeding the fear of a coup d'état. Every day that passed, the threat was closer. The enemies of the empire, both internal and external, stalked, waiting for the right time to attack. For Adriano, the load of power became increasingly heavy, a slab that seemed to crush him under his own weight. And thus, the shadow of death signed over Adriano. His health, once iron, weakened, the ailments afflicted. Old age was noticed in his body. But was it only the disease that led to an end? Many whisper of a decision made in the solitude of his villa, an irrevocable decision that would keep him forever from the imperial splendor. It is said that Adriano, aware of the decline of his empire, preferred death to witness his fall. A tragic end for a powerful emperor, so ambitious at the time, a decision that wraps his death in a halo of mystery, a decision that even today feeds speculation. The exact form of his death remains uncertain. Was it a premeditated suicide, or a disease that finally defeated it? The chronicles of the time offer contradictory versions, leaving a void in history that you, with your thirst for knowledge, you can try to fill. Research, look for the clues, because the enigma of Adriano's death continues to challenge historians. But what really ended with Adriano? The official version speaks of a disease, a long agony that was consumed slowly. Fevers, edema, and general weakening are mentioned. But do you think it was so simple? Historians and fans of Roman history have speculated for centuries, looking for answers beyond the disease. There are theories that point to possible poisoning. Perhaps a palatial conspiracy, political intrigues woven in the shadows of Roman power. Imagine powerful enemies, eager to happen, weaving a network of secrets to ensure its rise to the throne. A silent blow, a precision-managed poison? Other theories, more speculative, suggest that Adriano, aware of the instability of the empire and its own mortality, could have opted for suicide. A desperate act to avoid witnessing the fall of what he had built with so much effort. A terrible decision, but perhaps, for him, the least painful. But his death did not mark the end of his influence. Think of Adriano's wall, that imposing barrier that protected Britannia for centuries. A tangible symbol of his strategic vision. He was a pragmatic ruler, who understood the need to consolidate the borders of the empire and ensure their stability. Its legacy in this aspect is undeniable, a dividing line that lasts until today. In addition to the defense, Adriano promoted the construction of infrastructure throughout the empire. Remember the aqueducts, the bridges, the roads, all that facilitated trade and communication, joining the different parts of the vast Roman territory. Imagine the impact that this had on the daily life of citizens, a legacy of progress and connectivity that extended for generations. And let's not forget his patronage in the arts and culture. Adriano was a great lover of Greek and Roman art, promoting their development and preservation. His reign was characterized by an artistic flowering, leaving an aesthetic legacy that we still admire today. Think about sculptures, buildings, literature. A legacy of beauty and refinement that endures over time. But Adriano's greatness had a price. His death, unexpected for many, unleashed a struggle for power that no one had foreseen. You know that the Roman Empire was not a place for weakness. The imperial succession was a dangerous game, a board where ambitions faced death. There was no clear heir, and the absence of a designated successor opened the doors to the Palassiga intrigue. Prosody, speak. Speak, to prosody rate equals 90%, several applicants emerged from the shadows, each with their own supporters and strategies. The court became a battlefield where alliances were forged and broke with the same ease as the glass. Remember that power in Rome was not achieved only with brute force, but also with political cunning and manipulation. You will see how the struggle for imperial succession was not a simple issue of military force. Uncertainty reigned. Who would manage to control the legions? Who would win the favor of the Senate? The fate of the empire seemed to depend on a thread, swinging to the edge of chaos. You will realize that Adriano's death was not only the end of a life, but the beginning of an era of instability and struggle for power, a struggle that would define the future of Rome. The imperial succession, a crucial issue, became a struggle without barracks. But his legacy, you know it, transcended his own life. Adriano, despite his tragic end, left an indelible mark on the empire. Think of its vast construction program. Strengths that protected the borders, aqueducts that brought water to the cities, temples and libraries that enriched cultural life. All this, the result of a strategic vision and efficient administration. His reign brought a period of relative peace and prosperity, something that was not always common in Rome. Imagine the impact of this stability on people's daily lives. The possibility of building, trading, and simply living without the constant fear of war or political instability. He consolidated the borders and strengthened the power of the empire. In addition, his love for art and culture flourished during his government. He himself was a great admirer of Greek and Roman art, and his artistic patronage enriched the empire with masterpieces that last until today. Remember the number of buildings, sculptures, and mosaics that tell us about their time. His artistic influence is undeniable. But his relationship with the Senate, you know it, was complex. Adriano, despite his image as a powerful emperor, needed his cooperation. The Roman Senate, with its entrenched traditions and its influence, was a key actor in imperial politics that I couldn't simply ignore them. He needed his support to approve laws, raise taxes, and, above all, maintain the stability of the empire. Sometimes the collaboration was fluid. Adriano, a political cunning, knew how to win some senators with favors, strategic appointments, or even public works in their native cities. But other times, the clash between imperial power and senatorial tradition was inevitable. Disputes on the budget, fiscal policies, or succession to the throne generated constant tensions. Imagine the palatial intrigues, changing alliances, veiled accusations. Adriano, aware of the fragility of power, had to carefully sail these turbulent waters. His ability to maintain balance, at least for much of his reign, was crucial for his success, although also for his own political survival. The constant tension with the Senate was a shadow that pursued it until the end. But how did Adriano finance all this? Its fiscal system, although complex, was quite efficient. Imagine the machinery of the Roman Empire in full functioning. Legions, monumental constructions, bureaucracy, everything required a constant flow of money. Taxes were the engine of everything, raised in various ways depending on the province and its wealth. There were taxes on land, on trade, on inheritance, a true puzzle to maintain the imperial gear. Unlike some of his predecessors, Adriano struggled to maintain a balance between income and expenses. He was not a wasteful emperor, although a great builder. His public works, from the aqueducts to the defensive walls, generated employment and improved the infrastructure, but also required careful management of the funds. He supervised the accounts, something unusual for an emperor, showing a concern for the economic stability of the empire. However, maintaining balance was not an easy task. Wars, rebellions, and economic crises constantly tested the system. Adriano had to deal with unexpected situations that affected tax collection. And although he struggled to be fair, the pressure to maintain order and stability sometimes forced him to make unpopular decisions, increasing the tax burden in some regions rather than in others. It was an act of balance between need and justice. And speaking of that machinery, imagine the amount of public works that needed financing. Adriano, with his strategic vision, understood that the strength of the empire also depended on a robust infrastructure. Think of the roads, those vital tendons that connected every corner of the vast territory. Can you imagine traveling through them, witness to Roman power? Prosody, speak. Speak, prosody rate equals 90%. But the roads were not the only thing. Adriano promoted the construction of ports, those nerve points where trade flowed, bringing wealth and supplying the cities. Visualize those ships entering and leaving, loaded with goods from all over the known world at an impressive show, right? In addition to ports and roads, he thinks of Adriano's Wall, that impressive stone barrier that served through Britannia. A colossal work that protected the empire and made clear the scope of his power. Can you imagine the scale of that construction, the number of men and resources that were needed? And let's not forget the aqueducts, those wonders of engineering that brought fresh water to the cities. Imagine daily life in Rome, without the current water that these aqueducts provided, a legacy that endures to this day. Don't you think? But what did it make so special to the 2nd century? Think about him as a moment of apparent calm, a kind of respite in the storm. After the conquests and expansions, the empire focused on consolidating its power. The borders were relatively stable, allowing a period of prosperity and economic growth. Imagine cities blooming, trade thriving, and everyday life flowing with a relative peace. But you don't get confused. This calm was misleading. Under the surface, deep changes were cooked that would eventually mold the future of the empire. The growth of bureaucracy, for example, to manage such an extensive empire, more officials were needed, more laws, more control. This led to an increase in administrative complexity, something that, although necessary, also created new tensions and challenges. Remember that the efficiency of the administration was key to maintaining peace and prosperity, but it was also a double-edged sword that could generate more problems than solutions if it was not careful. And speaking of challenges, constant military pressure on borders, although less intense than in previous times, remained a reality. Minor wars, local rebellions, and the need to maintain a powerful army demanded a significant amount of resources. All this, added to the growing administrative complexity, tested the empire's ability to maintain stability. Anticipating the challenges that would come in the future, it was a precarious balance, a juggling game between peace and war, prosperity and threat. But returning to Adriano, did you know that his reign witnessed an impressive urban expansion? Not only consolidated the borders of the empire, but also dedicated itself to beautify and modernize existing cities. Imagine the new constructions, the infrastructure that improved everyday life. A whole time change. Think of Rome itself, transformed under your mandate. Adriano promoted the construction of new public buildings, magnificent temples, and improved the water supply system. A city that grew and was modernized by leaps and bounds thanks to its vision. But the expansion was not limited to Rome. Cities throughout the empire experienced significant improvements. New walls, port extensions, and the construction of impressive public buildings became the norm under the reign of Adriano. Can you imagine the impact that this had on the life of common people? But how did Adriano behave against the different religions of the empire? Unlike some of its predecessors, you will discover that Adriano opted for a policy of religious tolerance, although with nuances. It was not a fervent adhesion to all beliefs, but rather a pragmatic political decision. Maintaining peace and stability in such a diverse empire required a careful approach and, in many cases, the simple acceptance of religious diversity was the best option. Although he did not actively promote any religion in particular, Adriano did maintain the imperial cult, which presented him and his predecessors as divinized figures. This practice, common at the time, was not incompatible with its tolerance towards other religions. In fact, many temples and sanctuaries of different cults were built or restored during their reign. For you, this reflects an intelligent political strategy. Maintain social cohesion without imposing a single religious vision. However, Adriano's tolerance had its limits. The repression, although less frequent than at other times, was not absent. In some cases, certain cults considered subversive or that threatened public order were persecuted. But, in general, his approach focused on the pragmatic management of religious diversity, seeking the stability of the empire over the imposition of a single faith. For you, this raises the question, to what extent was religious tolerance a personal conviction or a political strategy? Prosody, speak. Speak, prosody rate equals 90%. So what is Adriano? You might think that your legacy is complex, right? A man who expanded the empire, built tirelessly, tolerated religions, but also a man who, in the end, retired himself, perhaps overwhelmed by the weight of his crown. His death, a mystery wrapped in the sadness of an emperor who preferred death to witness the decline of what he had built. His memory remains alive, not only for his architectural works that still last, but also for the contradictions that marked him. He was a pragmatic ruler, but also a deeply human man with his own doubts and fears. A hero. A villain. Perhaps, like many leaders, it was both. In history, you find Adriano as an example of the complexity of power. A man capable of great achievements, but also vulnerable to the pressures of his time. His final decision, to take our lives, leaves us with a deep reflection on the cost of leadership and the fragility of greatness. What do you think about your legacy? You will wonder, Why did he commit suicide? The truth, friend, is that there is no definitive answer. Some say that the disease weakened him so much that he preferred to die before suffering more. Others point to a deep disappointment. The weight of the empire, the palatial intrigues, perhaps simply tired of the fight, and his successor Antonino Pio. Was it a wise choice? Well, that is already a matter of debate. Adriano chose him for his moderate character and his government capacity, a commitment to stability after years of tensions. Some historians see it as a success, others, not so much. You can form your own opinion yourself. Finally, what can we learn from Adriano? Well, look, his story teaches us that even the most powerful emperors are vulnerable, that the weight of responsibility can be overwhelming. But it also shows us the importance of construction, tolerance, and the search for peace, even if it is ephemeral. What do you think? I hope you enjoyed learning about Adriano. If you liked it, like and subscribe for more fascinating stories in history. What did you think of Adriano's decision? Leave it in comments. /prosody/speak